Long before Solomon's name became synonymous with wisdom and wealth, he was simply the son of David, not the eldest, not the most expected, but chosen. The road to his kingship was not smooth, paved with political tension and threats from rival heirs. Yet, amid the turmoil, God's hand moved with precision and purpose. Through the prophet Nathan and the faithful voice of Bathsheba, Solomon was anointed as the next king of Israel. He did not seize the throne through ambition or warfare, but was appointed by divine will and secured by his father David's final decree. When the crown finally rested upon his head, Solomon could have asked God for power, vengeance, or fame. But in a dream recorded in 1 Kings 3:5-9, the Lord appeared and offered him anything he desired. Solomon, with a heart still tender and uncorrupted, asked not for riches or long life, but for wisdom to govern God's people with justice. He recognized his own limitations, referring to himself as a child in need of guidance. Pleased with this selfless request, God not only granted him unparalleled wisdom, but also promised him riches, honor, and longevity if he walked in obedience. It was the start of a reign, unlike any before it, marked by the fingerprints of heaven and the purity of a heart truly seeking to do right before God and his people. That wisdom soon manifested in ways that left the nation in awe. Perhaps no event better showcased Solomon's divine insight than the judgment between two women claiming the same child. With no witnesses and no clear evidence, Solomon proposed a shocking solution: to divide the baby in two. One woman cried out, begging the king to spare the child's life and give him to the other. Instantly, Solomon knew only a true mother would choose love over loss. The verdict spread like fire through the land, and the people stood in awe of a king whose discernment clearly came from God. But Solomon was more than a wise judge. He was a poet of the soul, a philosopher of divine truths, a theologian who gave language to the mysteries of life. He composed over 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs, each a thread in the spiritual fabric of Israel. His words shaped a generation and still echo today in the book of Proverbs, timeless counsel on character, diligence, justice, and the fear of the Lord. Kings and rulers traveled from distant lands to hear his wisdom, including the Queen of Sheba. Her visit was not one of casual curiosity, but of admiration so deep that it left her breathless. She saw more than gold and splendor. She witnessed divine order flowing from a man anointed to lead with truth. Solomon's crowning achievement was not his wealth or his wisdom. It was the temple, a project his father David had longed to build, but one reserved by God for Solomon's hands. In 1 Kings 6-8, we read of the magnificent construction of the temple in Jerusalem. 7 years of precise craftsmanship, cedar from Lebanon, gold overlay, and artistic detail unmatched in Israel's history. This was no ordinary structure. It was the dwelling place of the Most High, where heaven would touch earth. When the work was complete, Solomon gathered the leaders and elders of Israel to bring the Ark of the Covenant into its resting place within the most holy place. And then something extraordinary happened. As Solomon finished his heartfelt prayer of dedication, a cloud descended. The glory of the Lord filled the temple so fully that the priests could not stand to minister. It was the pinnacle of Solomon's reign, the purest moment of national worship and unity. Every heart was turned toward God, every voice lifted in awe. Solomon stood not just as king, but as a servant priest, interceding for his people. And in that holy temple, rich with sacrifice, praise, and presence, we see a foreshadow of a greater temple yet to come, Jesus Christ, in whom the fullness of God would one day dwell bodily. Following the temple's dedication, Israel entered its golden age. Peace reigned on all sides, trade routes flourished, Kings from distant lands paid tribute to Solomon, and the kingdom expanded far beyond anything seen before. 1 Kings 10 paints a picture of astonishing prosperity. Silver was considered of little value, so common it was barely worth counting. Everything Solomon touched turned to gold, literally. His throne was a marvel of ivory, overlaid with pure gold, flanked by lions and elevated above 6 majestic steps. The palace and the temple shone with wealth and grandeur. The people lived in safety, each under their own vine and fig tree, a phrase that spoke of complete security and well-being. Yet within this abundance, a quiet danger emerged. What began as a blessing risked becoming a burden. As the wealth increased, so did the temptation to take pride in it. Solomon's heart, once so fixed on God's glory, began to bask in human achievement. Gold, once used to honor the Lord, now adorned every corner of Solomon's house. The line between sacred devotion and self-exaltation grew thinner with each treasure added. The nation still prospered outwardly, but inwardly the seeds of spiritual drift had been sown. What if success became the snare? What if praise turned into pride? Solomon's ascent to greatness brought with it not only global fame and fortune, but dangerous entanglements of the heart. In a world where alliances secured peace, Solomon took the path of diplomacy through marriage, forging bonds with the surrounding nations by wedding their daughters. But what seemed politically wise was spiritually devastating. 1 Kings 11:3 tells us he took 700 wives, many of them princesses from foreign lands, and 300 concubines. This was not mere excess, it was a direct violation of God's law. Deuteronomy 17:17 had warned that a king must not take many wives, or his heart would be led astray. Yet Solomon, the man gifted with divine wisdom, disregarded the very command that would have preserved his soul. These marriages were more than political transactions, they were spiritual compromises. With each bride came customs, idols, and subtle seductions of the heart. Slowly, the man who had once prayed for a discerning heart began to lose his discernment. He didn't renounce Yahweh overnight. The drift was quiet, unassuming. Altars erected here, a shrine allowed there. But every step away from God was a step toward divided loyalty. The love of God was being diluted by the love of many, and soon the throne once guarded by divine wisdom was occupied by a heart deeply divided. What began with tolerance ended in tragedy. Solomon, once a worshipper who had seen God's glory fill the temple, became a builder of altars to false gods. 1 Kings 11:5-7 describes the abomination. He built high places for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, whose worship was steeped in sensual rituals, for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the Ammonite deity whose followers committed child sacrifice. These were not acts of ignorance, they were deliberate constructions in defiance of God's holiness. The horror is not only in what Solomon built, but in who he had become. The one who once stood with hands lifted in pure devotion now permitted the shedding of innocent blood. The burning of children on pagan altars within the land God had consecrated. The man who had authored proverbs on righteousness was now facilitating the most grotesque forms of idolatry. God had spoken plainly in Deuteronomy 12:3, "Tear down pagan altars, smash their sacred stones." And in Deuteronomy 17:17, he commanded kings to avoid multiplying wives and wealth. Solomon knew these commands. He had taught others to fear God. Yet wisdom without obedience became his downfall. It wasn't a lack of knowledge, but the erosion of reverence that led to his betrayal. The palace had become a sanctuary, not of the Lord, but of idols. And the wisest man alive had become the greatest fool. God, who had once appeared to Solomon in glory and favor, now appeared in judgment. The same voice that promised wisdom and prosperity now declared consequences. Solomon had broken covenant, building altars to foreign gods and allowing his heart to be turned from the Lord. 1 Kings 11:11 delivers the devastating verdict, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." Yet even in judgment, God remembered his promise to David. For David's sake, the full force of discipline would not fall in Solomon's lifetime. One tribe would remain under his son, preserving a remnant of the United Kingdom. Mercy and justice walked together. Then came the moment of prophetic symbolism. The prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam and, in a stunning act, tore a new cloak into 12 pieces. "Take 10, he said, "for this is what the Lord says. I am tearing the kingdom out of Solomon's hand." 1 Kings 11:29 through 31. The tearing of fabric mirrored the tearing of a nation. Solomon's unchecked heart had begun a fracture that would shake Israel's history forever. The golden age was over. The slow unraveling had begun. As Solomon aged, the splendor that once defined his reign could no longer shield him from the shadows gathering in his soul. The golden walls of his palace, the endless servants, the trophies of victory, none could silence the ache of regret. The man who once stood in awe before God now sat alone, surrounded by opulence but starved of peace. It was in these twilight years that Solomon turned inward and penned the words of Ecclesiastes, a raw and sobering reflection of a life that tasted everything but found nothing lasting. "Meaningless, meaningless," he writes in Ecclesiastes 1:2, "utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." This was not poetic exaggeration. It was the cry of a soul that had drifted from its source. He had built cities, gathered wealth, indulged in pleasure and chased wisdom, but all had become as vapor, vanishing, empty, unsatisfying. He wrote not from a place of triumph, but of repentance. "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." Ecclesiastes 2:10-11. Solomon had once held the world in his grasp, but in letting go of God, he lost himself. His final reflections were not about palaces or conquests, but about purpose. And in his last breath of wisdom, he returned to the truth he had once known. "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." Ecclesiastes 12:13. The sorrow of his final days became a legacy of warning and a whisper of hope. As Solomon neared the end of his life, the noise of celebration faded, and the silence of reflection grew louder. No longer was he the radiant young king who stood before a nation with wisdom from above. He had become a man haunted by the distance between who he once was and who he had become. And yet, from that brokenness came one final offering, the book of Ecclesiastes. It is not a record of power, but of perspective. It is not filled with boasts, but with brutal honesty. Solomon, once adored for his brilliance, now wrote like a man stripped of illusion. He had seen the vanity of wealth, the emptiness of pleasure, the shallowness of applause. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12:13. This was no longer the voice of a king speaking from a throne. It was the voice of a man who had wandered far from the path of life and returned with scars. His closing words are a gift not wrapped in gold but in grace, not to celebrate the heights of his reign, but to remind us of the only thing that lasts, not the glory of gold, but the glory of God. Solomon's story doesn't end with a monument, but with a mirror, one that invites every reader to examine their own life. We may not sit on thrones or govern nations, but like Solomon, we've all been blessed, trusted, and given influence in one form or another. And like Solomon, we are vulnerable to drift. What altars have we built in our own lives? Altars of ambition, pleasure, popularity, or comfort? Have we allowed our hearts to be divided by lesser loves? Solomon's fall wasn't immediate. It was slow, subtle, and disguised as success. His compromises were culturally acceptable, politically strategic, even admired, but they were deadly to his soul. Yet even in his failure, God's mercy shines. Though the kingdom was torn, the line of David was preserved. Through that line came the greater Son, Jesus, the true and eternal King. Solomon's fall, as tragic as it was, did not cancel God's redemptive plan. That same mercy reaches to us today. Let his life be a warning and also a call. Don't just begin with passion, finish with faithfulness. Don't trade intimacy with God for temporary gain. Don't wait until regret sets in to realize what matters most. Learn from the fall of the wisest man and resolve to live wiser still. The crown that counts is not made of gold, but of obedience. Finish well.